This week's theme on the Retirement Quick Tips podcast is your listener questions answered. Today's listener question is, do you feel the rule of thumb of 4% withdrawal rate in retirement is still applicable based on inflation, etc.? If not, what would you recommend for estimating a sustainable withdrawal rate in retirement? Okay, this is a great question, and it's one that has, like most questions that are personal finance related, there's a lot of gray area here. So let me just back up and sort of explain this rule of thumb, the 4% rule. I've talked about it a decent amount on the podcast because it has longevity. So this rule of thumb first came out and was popularized, I believe, in the 1990s. And so there was a researcher, I forget his name, and what he found is that you could pretty much pick any 30-year time period. It didn't matter. So it took into account you retiring at a really great time or retiring at maybe not so great a time and just timing it poorly or timing it really well. It didn't really matter as long as you had a balanced portfolio. In other words, you had kind of a broadly diversified portfolio. 60% stocks, 40% in bonds is traditionally what's used in this simulation. You could retire in like the early 70s, which would have been a really bad time to retire because inflation was high, taxes were still relatively high, investment returns were not that good, especially in the first years of retirement. And so retiring in the early 70s was pretty much the worst time. And then you pull that forward all the way for 25, 30 years. And so what this 4% rule found is that as long as you had a diversified portfolio, you could retire in the good times, bad times. It didn't really matter. If you started your withdrawal rate at 4% of your portfolio value and you increased that each year for inflation, you wouldn't run out of money. In fact, you would grow your portfolio over time and you would maintain the principal value and achieve some growth as well. This is a great starting place when you're just trying to estimate, do I have enough to retire? Because what you could do is you could say, okay, let's say you have $1 million. And in addition to that, maybe you have some other income sources like Social Security. Maybe you have an Airbnb and you get some rental income off of that. Whatever it is, you could look at your $1 million investment portfolio and you could say, okay, if I withdraw 4% in year one of retirement, I'm going to withdraw $40,000. I take that income and I combine it with my other income sources, Social Security, etc. So you can look at that and say, all right, let's say all in, I have maybe $70,000 of income in retirement if I were to retire, say, at that portfolio value. Is that enough? Is that income stream that portfolio can generate, is that going to be enough? And so it's a great place to start for just some calculations. You could say, well, I want to retire today, or what does my portfolio need to grow to in order for me to retire? And again, you could kind of try to hit this target through savings and working a little bit longer. You know, if my portfolio gets to X value, that's going to generate enough income based on the 4% rule. So again, it's great for some preliminary planning purposes. The challenge with it is really in its applicability to the real world. So the assumption is you start at 4% and you increase that every year for inflation. Right off the bat, we have a problem because most people are not going to see like, oh, what was the CPI index last year? Oh, it was 4.6%. Okay, I'm going to add that amount to the 4%. And now my new withdrawal rate is X. So you have to increase it a little bit each year for that inflation component, whatever that is. And so I don't know hardly any people, unless you really love spreadsheets, who are going to take the time to do it. Most people, what they do with the 4% rule is that they sort of just stick with that throughout retirement and they don't change it for inflation, which is actually fine. Like that would work too. But usually I think what would end up in those cases for the most part is that you would underspend and your portfolio might grow more than maybe you want it to. And you didn't get to enjoy your retirement years as much because you were living too frugally. The other thing is that life happens. So you want to be careful about having a 4% withdrawal rate and then, whoops, I need a new car. And whoops, I need a new AC unit, and whoops, I need a new roof. So you have all of these events that happen every year that cost money, and you have to take a little bit more from your portfolio. So you want to ensure if you're going to have the 4% rule or use that as your ballpark for determining your withdrawals every year in retirement, you want to maybe take a little bit less than that so that you have some wiggle room for the unexpected versus just doing the maximum amount every year. That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Ashley Michike, and this is the Retirement Quick Tips Podcast.